Civica Scuola Interpreti e Traduttori Altiero Spinelli in international relations. We'll be talking about international crisis with Professor Emanuele Valenti, who I thank for this lesson. I thank Converso for the streaming,
la professoressa Diana Shendrikova che si collegherà tra
the
poco, e
professor
le
who will connect
studentesse del
in a
corso
while,
di laurea magistrale in
and the students
interpretazione
in
per
the interpretation
l'interpretazione
class
verso l'inglese,
who will
il
be
francese
interpreting
e il
into
tedesco.
English, French,
Buona
and
lezione a
German.
tutti e grazie
Enjoy,
per la
and thank you
partecipazione. Ringrazio
for
anche
being
tutti
here.
quelli che hanno
Thank you
partecipato
to
all'organizzazione
everyone who
di questa
participated in
iniziativa.
the organization
Grazie
of
ancora.
this lesson. Thank you again.
Grazie Fabrizia,
Thank
spero che
you,
mi
Fabrizia. I hope
sentiate
everyone
bene.
can
Anch'io
hear me.
ringrazio la
I
scuola
want to
per
thank
questa
the
iniziativa, per
school
questa
for
idea che abbiamo
this
avuto
idea that we
in
had
comune.
together,
Anch'io converso per tutto il lavoro tecnico che c'è
and
dietro, ma
I want to thank Converso for all the technical
soprattutto le
work, and
studentesse
especially the students
del mio corso che tra pochi
in
minuti
my class
coinvolgerò. So che
who
ci sono
I'll mention
parecchie
in a
persone,
while.
spero
I
soprattutto
know that
tante
there are
scuole
many
collegate. Questa è
people,
una
and
questione
especially I hope many
importante, un
schools,
aspetto
because
importante
this is very
perché
important.
è
It is
necessario,
necessary
come dire, che ci sia chiarezza, che
that
i più giovani soprattutto
we
conoscano e
can make
capiscano quello
everything
che sta
clear so young
succedendo, no?
people
Visto
especially
che
can understand what
quello
is
che sta
going on.
succedendo non
Because
lontanissimo
what is
da
going
noi in
on
Europa
not too
è
far from here in
importante, è
Europe is
molto
important.
importante,
It is
quindi
very important.
l'obiettivo di
And
dell'apertura di questa
the
nostra lezione
meaning
è
of this
proprio questo.
class,
Ancora
this
diverse
lesson
scuole nella
is
giornata di
exactly
ieri
this.
ci hanno
Many
confermato
schools
che oggi si sarebbero
yesterday
collegate, quindi
confirmed that they
le
will
saluto, saluto
participate
i
today.
ragazzi, gli
I want to
studenti,
welcome
soprattutto
everybody, the
i più
students,
giovani.
especially the young
Allora,
ones.
oggi parleremo,
Today
ovviamente, lo sapete
we
tutti,
will talk, as
della
you all know,
guerra in
about
Ucraina,
the war in
della crisi
Ukraine,
ucraina,
the
dell'invasione russa
crisis and the Russian
dell'Ucraina.
invasion.
Ne parlano tutti, immagino
Everyone
che
is talking about
abbiate
it,
tutti visto
and I imagine all of you
immagini,
have seen
abbiate
images, have
letto
read
qualcosa di quello che sta
something about
succedendo,
what is going
quindi
on.
una guerra.
So
Quello che è
it is
successo
a
nell'ultima
war. What
settimana
happened in the
ha
last week
portato non solo
led not
l'Ucraina, ma
only
come vedremo c'è una
Ukraine,
situazione complessa e
as you can see,
difficile
there's a
da
very
alcuni
difficult and
anni,
complex situation
alcuni decenni, e tutto questo
that has been
resterà
going on
nella
for
storia
the
di
past
secoli.
decades.
Quello che è successo negli
Um,
ultimi giorni ha portato l'Ucraina in una
what
dimensione
happened led
completamente
Ukraine
nuova, ha
to a
portato anche l'Europa in una
completely new
dimensione
dimension,
completamente
led
nuova,
Europe to a
ha
new
portato anche il
dimension,
mondo
and
intero,
the
non
entire
inteso
world,
come arena, come
meaning
forum nel quale si
the
muovono
arena
i
where
diversi
everything
attori delle
is
relazioni
happening,
internazionali,
all the
soprattutto gli stati, in una
international
dimensione
relationships
completamente
are happening
nuova e
into a
in
new
buona
dimension,
parte
and
sconosciuta.
mostly
Un po' per
an
tutti. Quindi
unknown
a maggior
dimension.
ragione per questo
So
motivo è necessario
for this, it
fare
is
chiarezza. Quindi
necessary to make
racconteremo quello
everything
che sta
clear.
succedendo
I
oggi, ma
want to talk
soprattutto
about what's going
cos'è
on
stata
and
l'Ucraina
what
fino
was Ukraine
alla
until
scorsa
about
settimana,
last
fino
week,
a pochi giorni fa.
until a few
Questo
days
non
ago.
ci può aiutare a capire, a comprendere completamente, ma
This
sicuramente
won't
ci può
help us
dare
understand everything,
elementi
but
di
it can give
comprensione.
us
Allora,
some
noi in questa
elements
lezione
to
con le
understand.
studentesse abbiamo
So
già
this
parlato
class
di Ucraina, abbiamo già
will
dedicato
talk about
due
Ukraine.
lezioni,
With the
abbiamo
students, we have
deciso
already talked
appunto
for
anche
two
per
classes
l'apertura
about Ukraine,
del nostro
and we
corso di
decided
dedicarne una terza vista
to have a third
l'importanza, e
lesson
possiamo aggiungere
because of
tranquillamente anche
how
la
important this
gravità
situation
della
is
situazione.
and how
Alcuni di voi
difficult the
magari sono
situation
un
is.
po' più
Some of you
attrezzati e affezionati anche allo sviluppo delle
may
notizie ora per
care a
ora,
bit
per
more
esempio,
about
no? A
the
dare un
situation or the
consenso
news
della delicatezza, della fragilità anche di
because
questo
they want to
momento. Per
understand
esempio, una delle
how
notizie di questa
delicate the
mattina è che
situation is. For
i
example,
combattimenti tra
just this morning we had the
forze
news that
ucraine in
the
territorio
fight
ucraino hanno
between Ukraine
raggiunto la
and Russia
principale
led
centrale nucleare
got
in
to the
Europa, no?
biggest
Risposte
nuclear
ucraina,
plant in
la
Europe, in
centrale
southeast
di
Ukraine,
Zaporizhia. Quindi
the Zaporizhia nuclear
molta
plant.
attenzione perché gli sviluppi sono
So we have to pay attention
assolutamente
because
imprevedibili.
everything
Allora,
is
io come prima
unpredictable.
cosa, prima di partire
First thing
con
first,
il mio
before
racconto,
I
vedremo anche
start with my
insieme dei
story,
video, dei contributi
um,
giornalistici, no? In
we
modo
will
che vi
watch
possiate
some
avvicinare il più
videos, some
possibile alla
reports
situazione della
from
quale
newspapers, so
stiamo
we can understand a bit
parlando.
more the situation.
Voglio chiedere
But before all that, I
alla
want to
classe,
ask the
mi sembra
class,
che ieri
who decided
per
yesterday
scegliere chi avrebbe fatto questi
that
interventi.
they
Allora
would
io volevo capire dal vostro punto di
speak,
vista,
who would
visto che
speak
abbiamo
today.
già
I want to
parlato
understand
di
from
Ucraina,
your point of
quali
view
siano alcuni almeno degli
what are
elementi più
some of
importanti da
the
tenere in
most important elements to
considerazione
consider
per capire questa
when trying
situazione
to understand
così
this
complessa,
situation
questa
that
crisi
is
così
so
complessa. Ok, vi
complicated.
lascio la parola per qualche
So
minuto.
I'll let you speak for
Prego.
a few minutes.
Ecco, innanzitutto mi presento,
First of all, I
sono
want to
Sveva,
introduce myself. I'm
docente al corso
Sveva.
di comunicazione internazionale
I
e
studied
innanzitutto
international
buongiorno a tutte e
relations.
tutte.
Good
E
morning,
ricollego un po' a
everybody.
quello che ha detto il
I'll talk
professor Valenti dicendo che
about
è
the
una
same thing
questione
that Professor
parecchio
Valenti
complessa
mentioned.
e
It's a very
ne stanno
complex
parlando
situation. Everyone is
tant'è
talking
vero che
about
anche
it.
il mondo dello sport e della
Even
politica hanno espresso la loro posizione.
artists or
Penso che è più la
athletes are
dimensione
talking about
storica
it,
e politica,
but I
la
concentrate on
dimensione in
the
cui
historic
emergono
and
le
political
questioni diciamo,
situation.
più delicate. Basti pensare che
We have
sia
to
la
think
NATO e
that
l'Unione
both
Europea
NATO
stanno
and the
cercando di
EU
intervenire, ma
are
calibrando
trying to
molto la loro posizione
intervene,
perché
but
non
trying
vogliono
to be as
accelerare
neutral as
la
possible
messa
because they
in
don't
fase
want to
dell'escalation della
escalate
Russia.
this
E
situation with
tant'è vero che
Russia.
qualche giorno fa
Just a
l'Unione
few days
Europea
ago,
ha
the
deciso di
European Union
impegnarsi
decided
e adoperarsi per far sì che
to
l'Ucraina diventasse un candidato per
make
far
Ukraine
parte
a
dell'Unione
possible
Europea,
candidate to join the
nonostante
European
non
Union,
riesca a soddisfare tutti i vari
despite the fact
requisiti
that it
necessari
doesn't
per
have
la
all the
relazione
right
dello status
requirements
di paese
to
e membro
become
dell'Unione Europea.
a member
La
state
stessa
of the
NATO
European
non può
Union.
intervenire
NATO itself can't
direttamente,
intervene
dato che
directly
l'Ucraina non fa
because
parte della NATO,
Ukraine isn't
ma
part of
sta
NATO,
inviando
but
armi
they
a
are
sostegno
sending
della resistenza
weapons
ucraina.
to help Ukraine
E
and the
poi ci
resistance.
sono tanti altri
And
attori
there are
extraeuropei
many
che
other
come
extra-European
per esempio gli
factors,
Stati Uniti,
for example, the
che anche
United
loro stanno
States,
cercando di dare il
who
loro
are trying
contributo in
to
armi.
help
La
with
posizione
weapons.
abbastanza ambigua della Cina, che
China's
sostiene la Russia
position,
per
which is a bit
ragioni
ambiguous,
economiche, ma allo stesso
who
tempo deve fare attenzione
supports
a ogni
Russia
eventualità,
for
perché la Cina
the
stessa si
economy,
trova in
but
una
is
situazione
also trying
molto
to be
simile,
careful
per
because
esempio con
China
la sua
itself
relazione con Taiwan.
is in a
E
similar
poi è
situation with
fondamentale
Taiwan.
anche porre l'accento sul peso
So, and
della
we also
storia.
have to focus on
Putin ha
history.
giustificato questa sua
Putin
azione
justified
militare
this military action, as he
utilizzando dei
described it,
simboli molto importanti,
with
utilizzando anche
some
dei
symbols,
termini che hanno un
using
specifico significato per
certain
la
words that have a
demilitarizzazione
specific
e la
meaning,
demilitarizzazione dell'Ucraina,
such as
e proprio il suo intervento è stato giustificato
demilitarization of
per
Ukraine,
salvare e proteggere
to
la
save
popolazione
and
russofona della
protect
zona del Donbass che per
the
ragioni storiche
pro-Russian
sono estremamente
population in
legate alla
the
Russia.
Donbas region, who,
E adesso
for historic
lascio la parola alla mia collega Lucrezia.
reasons, are closer to Russia.
Grazie, buongiorno.
Thank
Sono
you. Good
Lucrezia
morning.
e
I'm
anch'io come Sveva
Lucrezia, and
frequento
like
il
Sveva,
filone di
I'm
relazioni internazionali.
in the
Ci
first
sono
year of
altre
international
questioni che a
relations.
noi
There
come
are
gruppo classe ci
certain
sono sembrate
questions that
delicate, come
are
il fatto che si
delicate.
parlasse di una
For
terza
example,
guerra
talking
mondiale,
about a third
data
world
dalla
war,
vicinanza dell'Ucraina alla
because
Russia,
Ukraine is
dell'Ucraina
so
e
close
Russia
to
all'Occidente,
Ukraine and
e
Russia are
quindi il modo
so close to
appunto
the
in cui
West,
noi percepiamo il
and
conflitto
the way we
e
perceive this
soprattutto la
conflict,
minaccia
and
del
especially
nucleare,
the
così
nuclear threat.
come si sta parlando di
We're also
la
talking
creazione
about
e l'unificazione sotto la grande madrepatria
um,
russa
the
si stavano
identification
chiedendo
with
infatti durante
Russia,
le
and
elezioni
we were
se
wondering
la Russia si fermerà
if
all'Ucraina e del
Russia
fatto
will
che gli
stop
altri
with
paesi
Ukraine,
che fanno
or
parte della
if
NATO
other countries
servirà
that are
come deterrente.
part of NATO can
Un'altra
stop this.
questione che ci siamo
Another
appunto chiesti
reason,
era
another thing
come
that
i
we
media
asked
russi
ourselves,
stessero
how Russia,
proponendo
the
la
Russian media, are
situazione,
talking
il
about the
conflitto tra
situation, the
Russia e
war
Ucraina,
between Russia and
e
Ukraine,
tra le varie notizie
and
si nota appunto una
among
sorta di
all the
censura
news,
da
we can
parte dai
notice
media
a sort of
russi e
censorship
l'introduzione
um, from the Russian
dell'incarcerazione fino a
media,
15 anni per la
and the
divulgazione
threat
di
of
notizie false, così
jail time
come
up to 15
il
years
fatto che le
for fake
manifestazioni
news,
si stiano
such as the
vengano
protests
ripetute nonostante siano
that are
manifestazioni
stopped,
pacifiche,
regardless
tanto
of
che
the
i
fact that
leader
they
e
are
i portavoce
peaceful protests,
non
or the
parlino
fact that
mai
leaders
di
never
invasione,
mention
bensì
an
di
invasion
transizione
but a
e di, come
liberation,
diceva Sveva,
or as Sveva was
demilitarizzazione.
saying,
E infine, per
demilitarization.
ultimo, la questione umanitaria.
And
Basti
last but not
pensare
least, the
che
money.
dal 24 febbraio ci sono
Since
quasi 1 milione
February
di
24th, there
sfollati
have been about a
e
million
donne e bambini,
refugees,
anche perché
women
donne
and
sono
children, especially
rimasti
because
appunto in
men
Ucraina a causa della
stayed in
situazione attuale
Ukraine
per prestare
due to martial law
appunto
because
aiuto
they
e
want to help
a causa della chiamata alle armi
and
e
they need to join the
diciamo
army.
l'unico aspetto
So
positivo è appunto
the only
ieri che
positive
durante i
effect is that
colloqui, il
yesterday,
secondo round di colloqui,
during
si pensa che sia stato
the last round
raggiunto
of talks, they thought that they
un
reached
accordo per
um, a new a new deal to let people leave Ukraine.
During the lessons and what is going on. Thank you.
Allora, grazie mille Sveva e
Thank you,
Lucrezia,
Zeva and
grazie mille alla classe
Lucrezia.
Sofia,
Thank
ieri vi
you
siete
to my class.
confrontate
I know that
proprio su
yesterday you
su
talked
questi
about it,
punti.
and
Ottimo, avete toccato
it's a very good
diversi
point. You
elementi.
talked about
Allora, io
several
adesso
elements, and
condivido
today I would like to share
il mio schermo,
my screen.
una finestra, eccola qua,
Here it is,
nella quale
in which
possiamo
we can
vedere
see
la mappa
the map,
dell'Ucraina.
Ukraine's map.
Allora, eccoci qua. Eccoci qua. Allora, dovreste vederla tutti.
You should see
Allora,
it.
Sveva e
Okay,
Lucrezia hanno
Zeva and
toccato
Lucrezia
diversi
touched
temi. Dove
several
siamo
topics. Where are
innanzitutto?
we?
Avrete imparato,
You
molti
would have
avranno
learned,
imparato un po' a
many would have
conoscere
learned to
questa regione.
understand this
Siamo
region.
nell'est
We are
dell'Europa.
in the
Questa
east
è
of Europe.
l'Ucraina,
This is
vedete?
Ukraine.
Qua c'è la Russia.
There's Russia
Quindi ci
over
vediamo un
there.
po'. Ok, qua c'è la Russia.
Okay, there's Russia.
Sopra l'Ucraina c'è la
Then there
Bielorussia,
is
sotto
Belarus,
c'è il Mar Nero
the Black
e
Sea,
intorno ci sono
and
i
then
paesi
around them there
europei
are the
che in
European
buona
countries.
parte sono membri
There
dell'Unione
are, but
Europea
for the
e anche
majority,
della NATO,
members of
l'Alleanza
NATO
Atlantica.
and the European Union as
Estonia,
well.
Lettonia, Lituania, andando da nord a sud la
Latvia,
Polonia,
Estonia, and Lithuania,
la Slovacchia, la Romania e anche la
Romania,
Moldavia.
and Moldavia.
La Moldavia non fa parte
Moldavia is not a
della
part
NATO.
of the
Eccoci qua.
NATO.
Allora,
Here we are.
in questa vicenda
Okay, in
ci
this
sono molti
situation there
elementi.
are many elements.
C'è la geografia.
There is geography.
L'Ucraina si trova
The Ukraine
e si è
is
sempre
situated
trovata, ovviamente, negli
has
ultimi
always been
secoli,
in the last centuries
in una
in
zona
an
che
area
possiamo
that
definire
we
di
could
cerniera,
define as
che separa
a
il mondo
area that
russo dal mondo
divides the
europeo, come poi a un
Russian
certo
from the
punto è
European
diventato nel
world
secolo scorso, no?
that from this last century has
L'Occidente.
become
Se
Western
intendiamo per
countries,
l'Occidente
West.
Europa e
As when
Stati
we talk
Uniti.
about West, we mean
E
Europe
lo è
and
ancora
United
oggi
States,
ed
and
è
it
un
still is
elemento centrale.
today. It's
Questo.
a
La
a
Bielorussia,
fundamental point. Belarus,
ex
a
Repubblica dell'Unione
former
Sovietica,
republic
come
of
anche
the
l'Ucraina e
Soviet
come
Union,
anche
such as
i paesi
Ukraine
baltici,
and the
Estonia,
Baltics,
Lettonia e Lituania, rappresentano e
they
continuano a
represent, have
rappresentare
always represented,
una specie di
a sort
confine
of border
tra la Russia
between Russia
e il resto
and the rest
dell'Europa.
of
I
Europe.
paesi baltici,
The
Estonia, Lettonia e
Baltics
Lituania, fanno parte
are
dell'Unione
part
Europea
of the
e della
European
NATO.
Union and NATO as
La
well.
Bielorussia no, ed è
Belarus
un
doesn't,
solido alleato
and it's a
della
strong
Russia.
inner ally of Russia.
L'Ucraina
Is
è una via di
is
mezzo,
a sort
nel
of, it
senso
stays in the
che
middle, because
poi ripercorreremo tutta la
then we
storia,
will
ma
talk about the
dalla
history
fine
from the
della guerra
start.
fredda,
But
dalla
since the
caduta del
start
muro
of
di
the Cold
Berlino,
War and the fall
scomparsa
of the
dell'Unione
Berlin's Wall,
Sovietica, l'Ucraina
Ukraine
1991 diventa
1991 becomes
indipendente.
an independent country.
Diventa indipendente e
It
cerca di
becomes an
costruire
independent country and tries
costruirsi
to
una sua propria
build
identità e
its
anche una
own
sua propria, come dire,
identity and its
posizione,
own
un suo posizionamento
position
geopolitico,
in a
sulla
geopolitical
base
mean
dei partiti,
context,
dei
on the
leader, dei
basis of
movimenti
leaders,
politici che sono stati
parties,
al governo.
and social
A
movements that
volte
were
l'Ucraina è stata più
within the
vicina alla
government,
Russia
and it was closer
negli
to
ultimi
Russia
30
in
anni, altre
in the
volte è
last
stata
30
più
years,
vicina
and
invece
other times it
all'Europa,
was
nel
closer to
senso che i
Europe. And I mean
governi
that
che sono succeduti
governments,
al potere a
the
Kiev, la
governments that
capitale
came one after
dell'Ucraina, quella
another,
città che, come avrete visto
and
dalle
that, as
immagini
you
di
can
questi
see
giorni,
from
è
the
quasi
today's
sotto
images,
assedio da parte delle forze
now
russe,
is
in questo caso
is
quella
being
regione
attacked by the
entrate da
Russians.
nord, quindi dal confine russo e dal
So
confine con
from
la
the
Bielorussia.
this border that you can
A
see
volte ha
there,
stretto, diciamo così,
sometimes
alleanze, ha
it
fatto
has
accordi
forged
con l'Europa, con l'Unione
alliances
Europea,
with the
ha
European Union.
collaborato
It
anche
has
con la NATO, per
worked
esempio
with
con delle
NATO,
esercitazioni
with
militari in
some
territorio ucraino. Altre volte
military
invece ha risaldato
in
i
the military
rapporti con la
field,
Russia, per
and it
esempio
has
anche da un punto di vista economico. Quindi diciamo che
built
negli
this
ultimi 30 anni
relationship
il
with
potere
Russia. So
politico
the
ucraino
political
è andato un po' da una
power
parte, un
of
po'
Ukraine
dall'altra. È stato un po'
switched from
alternato,
Russia and Europe.
possiamo dire.
it was like undefined. But if we think about history, we could see, so we go back in time compared to the end of the Cold War, so like the period of time of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, the two world wars, and we go far beyond that, we could discover that this area that today is Ukraine, the state of Ukraine, and today we really don't know what the future could be for Ukraine, but it has always been moved from a part to another, and the Ukrainians and the inhabitants of the country for generations have been looking at Russia and at Europe. So this, in terms of a political positioning, from a political point of view, and also an identity and cultural point of view, this is a pivotal element, and we will be able to deepen the situation after 10 a.m. when my colleague will join, Diana Shendrikova, and she is going to explain to us the importance of the identity during time. But we can already say that this is a fundamental element. And being a territory that has been for a long time, has moved below Russia's influence, and then with the establishment of the Soviet Union, and then from 1920s, around the 20s to 1990s, 1991, this area, many people, in a cultural point of view and from a linguistic point of view, felt or were Russian, or as we say in a technical way, like Russian speaking. So I would like to zoom on my map. Google Maps always helps us. We are able to understand what's going on at the moment as far as the Russian military operations are concerned. A country moved that switches from a part to another. It means that the western part has always been closer to Europe, even from a linguistic point of view, a cultural point of view, and in that area where the Ukrainian language was born, where Ukrainian is spoken. Then there is this river, Dnepr, that cuts the country in two, from Kiev, the capital, and other many important cities, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, where there is a nuclear power plant I just mentioned, and then Kherson and the Black Sea. At the moment, in these days, the military operations are focusing in that part, in this part of Ukraine, and that is the part of the country that has always been more closer to Russia. And the operations are sorry. And there are also the NATO's countries. It couldn't be otherwise. But it is like this, and the two things overlap. So you have to take this thing into consideration. It is like a country cut in two, but the situation is always more complex. We talk about war, we could also talk about anything else, but since the reality is always complex and we have to ask many questions to ourselves, this river I mentioned divides the country in two, but this is not a strong division, even from a personal point of view. till the invasion, the day when Russia invaded Ukraine, many communities, many cities, and many people within that area felt both Russian and Ukrainian, and they felt a multicultural identity, also a Russian identity linked to the Russian traditions, and they also, but their political point of view was more linked to the Europeans' ideas. So we, us from a political point of view, we feel really close to the Russian traditions, or otherwise from on the with the European Union's traditions. They've always been talking Russian, but they've always felt linked and having a bond with Russia, and this border is a political border. And in this area, in the eastern areas, there are many families with many people having relatives from in the other part of the border.
Naturally, what has happened last week, so the decision of the Russian government, and especially the decision of the Russian president that we have all learned to know, Vladimir Putin, has marked a radical change. This is the situation where this war is rooted. So the picture that we had in mind, the global situation of last week has changed as well. I want to say something to the audience that is following our webinar from outside of our class through our web page. You have the chance to send questions, and we will deal with these questions. We will answer them in the last part of our lecture today. Before considering other elements, we've already talked about geography, culture, identity, military strategy, psychology. There has been a different decision of Vladimir Putin, the last decision of the Russian president. We have the profile of a political leader that is taking decisions on the basis of different local balances inside Russia. So there are a lot of things to consider when we talk about Ukraine. So before continuing, I want to show you a video. Every video that you're going to see during our lecture are small reportages that I realized, that I created during the years in Ukraine. I came back from Ukraine a few days ago. These videos have all been transmitted by the RSI, Radiotelevisione, svizzera, italiana, and they have been created by me and a colleague who dealt with the filmmaking part. These videos have all been recorded around 10 days ago, just before the break of the war, in a region that from 2014 till now has seen an armed conflict with a very low intensity in the southern eastern region of Ukraine. This military conflict wasn't a full-on war. It was fueled by pro-Russian rebels that took control of a small portion of the Ukrainian territory
And from then on, kept on fighting more or less intensely against the Ukrainian army. So there was already an army in Ukraine before the full-on war broke out, but it was limited to a small portion of the Ukrainian territory. So many people thought that this conflict would just break out in that limited area. This video that we recorded was shot in the southwest of Ukraine, and we'll see it now.
Avdiivka è in prima linea nella guerra nel Donbass e questo quartiere è l'ultimo ancora parzialmente abitato prima delle postazioni dell'esercito ucraino a soli 10 chilometri da Donetsk. Nonostante le condizioni estreme, i lunghi periodi passati nei rifugi, la gente cerca di andare avanti. Nikolai, 81 anni, ha perso la moglie pochi mesi fa. Nel 2015 è stato ferito a una gamba durante un bombardamento. Ero per strada, ho sentito un colpo e ho cercato riparo. In quel momento ho visto del sangue dietro di me. Mio figlio mi ha portato all'ospedale, per fortuna le ossa erano a posto, ma ho ancora dolore. Però andrà tutto bene. La ricerca di normalità contrasta con il paesaggio. Gli edifici più esposti sono completamente distrutti, abbandonati. Qui non vive più nessuno. Entriamo in quello che un tempo era un grosso palazzo residenziale. Fino a un certo punto si può ancora salire. Da queste finestre sparavano i cecchini, costantemente sotto il fuoco nemico. I combattimenti sono stati molto intensi. Non è rimasto nulla. Questo palazzo completamente distrutto, l'avete visto, ci sono solamente macerie, è stato uno dei punti caldi del conflitto, di una grossa battaglia qui nel 2014 all'inizio della guerra nel Donbass. Molti temono però che possa succedere ancora la stessa cosa in questi giorni. In effetti la linea del fronte è solamente pochi chilometri, 3 o 4 chilometri dietro di noi. Poco più in là sono tornati a spararsi questa settimana esercito ucraino e ribelli filorussi. Chi abitava qua ogni tanto torna a vedere la sua casa. Lo fa anche Artyom, 12 anni, cresciuto con la guerra nel Donbass. Quando è iniziata era molto piccolo. Ricordo le bombe e la fuga dalla nostra casa. Ci spostiamo di qualche strada. Questo quartiere corre parallelo alla linea del fronte. Siamo a metà pomeriggio. Apparentemente gli abitanti sono tranquilli. È una provocazione da entrambe le parti, come al solito. Ci sono sempre delle case completamente distrutte, con molti danni, anche davanti a noi. Una provocazione.
Как думаете, придут к Минским соглашениям или к чему?
Рано или поздно.
Durante l'intervista il suono dei bombardamenti è sempre più forte. Lo stesso Sergei ci dice che il colpo, che abbiamo appena sentito, è caduto vicino e che per nostra sicurezza è meglio andare via. È lui a indicarci la strada più veloce per uscire dal quartiere. Sergei invece rimane. È la sua vita di tutti i giorni. Lasciamo Avdiivka a quella che potrebbe essere un'altra notte molto difficile.
E sulla situazione di crisi tra Ucraina e Russia abbiamo raccolto le considerazioni del presidente della società degli ucraini
Okay, so
di Svizzera.
let's go back to our lecture. I'm going to share my screen again now so that you can see what we're talking about. So let's get closer and then we'll see the historical context of this region. So as I said, it's a portion of the Ukrainian territory that has been controlled by pro-Russian rebels since 2014. And 3 days before the Russian invasion, Moscow, the Kremlin, decided
to give Luhansk and Donetsk the independence, to recognize them as independent regions. So, from 2014, the Ukrainian government doesn't have the control of these regions anymore. The video that we just saw was shot in Avdiivka, which you can see on the map. There is a line on this city that crosses the city where Russians, pro-Russians and pro-Ukrainian fight. The other video that I'm going to show you was shot in Kharkiv. You may have heard this name during these days because it's the second biggest city in Ukraine, and it's a very important city because it was the first capital of Ukraine when the Soviet Union was born, and so the Ukraine became one of the socialist republics. There was a big university in Kharkiv as well. So I stopped sharing my screen. What we understand from this video and what has stayed with me in my mind is that just a few days before the war, the local population, although the news were talking about a build-up of troops on the border with Russia, the majority of the population didn't think that a military operation of this scale was going to be possible. So let's see the second video.
E diretti proprio verso la frontiera.
Da Kharkiv si può arrivare in Russia in meno di un'ora. Nonostante il rischio di un'operazione militare di Mosca, la strada è ancora aperta. Un cartello ci indica che siamo entrati nella zona di confine. Ci stiamo avvicinando agli ultimi villaggi prima del passaggio di frontiera. Kazaja Lopan è l'ultimo centro abitato lungo la strada. Come tutta l'Ucraina orientale, questo territorio è da sempre fortemente legato alla Russia. Sono anni che l'Ucraina è in guerra e da un momento all'altro potrebbe anche peggiorare. Ma noi e i russi siamo come un'unica famiglia. Forse questo ci può salvare. Anna, 79 anni, è originaria dell'Ucraina occidentale. È una delle poche persone qui a parlare ucraino e non russo. Ho paura di quello che potrebbe fare Putin, certo, ma cerco di stare tranquilla. Sono andata a fare la mia spesa. Vediamo cosa succede. Qui vivono poche centinaia di persone. Lavoro in un supermercato. Ci rendiamo molto bene conto della tensione e dall'aumento dei prezzi del cibo. Non mi fido del nostro governo, ma voglio essere ottimista. Non ci resta che mantenere la calma. Una lunga fila di tir aspetta di entrare in Russia. Quello di Kazaja Lopan è l'unico passaggio di frontiera aperto in tutta la regione. Questo ovviamente è per tutti una situazione molto difficile. Avete sentito cosa ci hanno appena raccontato, si percepisce paura, preoccupazione, ma nonostante tutto le comunità che vivono in questa regione, in questa zona di confine con la Russia, stanno cercando in ogni modo una loro normalità. Ci spostiamo a Prudianka, un altro villaggio a ridosso della frontiera. Il sindaco ci racconta che sta cercando di occuparsi della vita e dei problemi di tutti i giorni. Sappiamo dei movimenti militari russi, la popolazione si è preparata, ma preferiamo pensare ad aggiustare le strade e al lavoro nei campi tra poco, in primavera. A ridosso del confine russo, almeno ancora in queste ore, si cerca di pensare alla quotidianità. Ecco, questo era pochi giorni prima.
This was a couple of days before, just a week before the invasion, the Russian invasion that started between the 23rd and the 24th of February. of last week. So I showed you this to give you an idea of where we are, what's the situation like. So I'll go back to our map. So, we said geography, history, geopolitics, culture, identity. If we go back in history, and as I said earlier, we will focus specifically on the linguistic and culturally important situation, we will see how the main thing was this separation, even though it wasn't really a net separation between East and West, between the Russian world and the Western world. In this crisis, if we want to make things really easy, there are two levels. There is an international level. There is a huge opposition between Russia and Western countries, the NATO, Europe and the United States. That's why Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, up until yesterday, but he's been doing this for a long time. He said that Russian security has been threatened by NATO, the military alliance, the military agreement that started after the Cold War, that was against Russia. So there is this international element. That's why Moscow and Putin state that our goal is to make Ukraine neutral, to demilitarize this country. This country must never join NATO. This will be a threat too big for us. And then he adds all this cultural level. Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. But then there is a regional dimension. There is an opposition between Russia and Ukraine, or at least some parts of Ukraine or the political power of Ukraine. But these two levels are linked to a third level, the internal level, the local level, the domestic level, the features of the characteristic of this country, its internal divisions, cultural and linguistic influences, and really a lot of differences in between its society. There are a lot of crises in these situations. It's like a Russian doll. Every situation is inside another and another and another. Every level is really important to understand the other level. And all three of these levels give us the overall view of the situation. And speaking about this separation, now it's a political separation. When in 1991 Ukraine became independent, as I said before, leaders and parties alternated with Kiev, with the government, and they were pro-European or pro-Russian. And there are a lot of the results of the elections told us the same thing. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll ask Converso to show the Ukrainian map of 2004 during the elections, the second map that we saw yesterday. I'll tell you a little bit about the behind the scenes of my lessons. And this map will show you the results of the elections of 2004 in Ukraine. Here it is. That year was really complex because those elections had to be repeated. It's the year of the Orange Revolution, and it's the first time in which the opposition between the two souls of Ukraine really came through, between its Western side and its Russian side. The president, Yushchenko, was voted in the central part of Ukraine. The other, Yanukovych, who had a pro-Russian approach, and I am making this really, really easy so that everybody can understand. And of course, maybe outside of this, there are people who know a lot more about this, but I have to make it comprehensible for everybody, understandable for everybody. So as you can see, there is a part of Ukraine who was pro-Western and another part who was pro-Russian. And now let's go to the latest elections during 2019 in Ukraine. They represent an exception. And now we'll see why. 2019 was a year in which Zelensky was elected, the current president. I think you all know him because today we see him on the news every day. Zelensky in 2019 was voted basically in all the areas of Ukraine except for Crimea, and except of a little western part. But the only regions, I think a couple of regions, the only regions that didn't vote for him voted for Poroshenko. In 2019, there was a crisis, there was a conflict in the southeast of Ukraine, and that's why Ukrainian society decided to vote this kind of President Zelensky, who was kind of above all this situation, pro-Western, pro-Russian, and I would like to add that Zelensky wasn't a politician, he was an actor. He was actually a comedian. And he promised that he would go over this situation, and he was voted by everybody. This was an exception if we consider the recent history of Ukraine.
And now I'll share my map once again. So let's try to quickly understand the history. We said that Ukraine has been partly conquered or controlled by Western powers, above all Poland, but also the main actor has always been Russia. For a very long time, there was the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. This led to a very peculiar society in Ukraine, where there are different languages and different cultures. One of the main elements of this battle in order to control the identity of Ukraine was also the church. Russia used the Orthodox Church in order to control more Ukraine. But what we really want to talk about today is another thing, because Diana Shendrikova will talk about the history part of this event. So let's talk about what happened in the last few years. So the end of the Cold War, the former republics of the USSR become independent countries, and some of them, just like the Baltic republics, quickly enter into the Western world. And in the following years, they become part of the European Union and of NATO. Ukraine stands in the middle. It goes west and east both. There are many juxtapositions. I had already talked about 2004 when we talked about the Orange Revolution. But the main point is 2013, 2014. During those years, the Ukraine government, and if we want to talk about recent history, this is actually the beginning of the current crisis. The then government in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Russian, decides not to sign an agreement with the European Union. And this agreement was ready, but he decides not to sign it. And he thinks that this is a very risky step for Ukraine, because it might be too pro-Western. It was an association agreement. This decision was influenced by Russia. Part of the Ukrainian society doesn't like that he didn't sign the agreement, and that's why uprisings started, and they become more and more, they become bigger and bigger. And this happens in the western part of Ukraine. We see Ukrainian and also European flags in the main squares where people protest, to underline this tie with Europe. So people ask Yanukovych to think again and actually sign the agreement. But he doesn't step back, and he decides at the end of 2013, in December, and he signed the refusal in November. As I said, he decides to sign an agreement, an economic agreement with Russia. When protests become so big and so important, we are actually in February 2014. Kiev's square is always full of people, every day and every night. These protests were then called Maidan. Maidan is the main square in Kiev, because Maidan means square. So, what happens? One morning, and we still don't know many things about this, one morning there are some shootings in this square. The security services open fire, but they are not the only ones who shoot. But the result is that there are more than 100 deaths in this square. And this is really a crucial moment for what we are experiencing today.
What happens then? Europe is trying to mediate this moment, and Russia as well, but they can't seem to find an agreement. And the Ukrainian president leaves Kiev, leaves the country. He goes to Russia, and the parliament decides for a transitional government. And this new president represents a more European point of view. Yanukovych says that he is in Russia on TV, and he says that there's been a coup d'etat. So there's a new government that has taken my place. This transitional government starts working, but at the same time, the other part of Ukraine that was calm, so the eastern region, starts some protests. And they say that they do not recognize this new government. They don't like it because it's too pro-Western. There are many protests in different cities, in eastern UK, Kharkiv as well, and then in the southeast. This is the Donbass region, so the southeast of Ukraine. There are many protests, huge ones, and the protesters enter into various administrative buildings. The temporary government decides to intervene in a very decisive and violent way in order to take back control in some important cities. But we are already entering into a very critical phase, because the fact that the government has acted in this very powerful way causes another powerful answer. The two forces fuel each other, and this protest becomes an armed one. In 2014, in spring, the protest movements are not only peaceful ones in squares, but they are also armed, and they try to take control in different areas. At the same time, before all this happened, so in March 2014, Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, or at least it was in the past, becomes part of Russia. Right after the various protests in Kiev and the change of government, there is a movement that starts, there is a grassroots movement that starts from the various local governments, but there's also an intervention of military forces. And although they cannot be recognized because they they dress in green, but they are actually Russian militaries, they take control of the region.
There is a referendum in the second part of 2014. 16th of March, a referendum for Crimea. There aren't any people from the outside checking this referendum, and apparently the majority of the population in Crimea voted to be a part of Russia, a Russian Federation, and in a matter of a few days Russia accepts. So Crimea becomes a part of Russia. This is something that the international community does not recognize. Crimea, to this day, is a problem that hasn't been solved. These days, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has asked again to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory. Crimea has a particular story because even during the USSR, up until a certain point, was part of Russia. Then in the 50s, it was given, was donated to Ukraine in 1954, if I remember correctly. So the important thing is that the eastern part of Ukraine at some point start to protest. They don't accept what is going on. They don't accept this change in power. There aren't any fights in Crimea. There aren't any deaths. In the southeast, in the Donbas region, in May 2014, there are two independent republics, the Independent Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk. So fights start to happen. We saw a video in the beginning. People kept fighting for years. In 2014, 15, it was more intense. On the one hand, there were pro-Russian rebels who had the support of Russia, even if Russia declines that they participated up until last week. But other sources say that Russia has been present in this area for a while. And on the other hand, there is the Ukrainian army, as we saw in the video earlier. The video was quite close to the line, to the border. So since 2015, there has been a freeze. This conflict stopped. The two parts have reduced the attacks against the so-called enemy, but there hasn't been a solution, a political solution. There was an attempt to negotiate between Russia and Ukraine, and as well as the local authorities in these two republics. And in 2015, there was an agreement, the Minsk agreement, but that was never applied, that said that these two territories would be part of Ukraine, and Ukraine would have had the control of the entire border with Russia. But at the same time, the agreement said that these two regions would have had a particular status, a particular autonomy, almost a sort of confederation, so a certain autonomy. Then the Ukrainian parliament and the government never approved of this agreement. This autonomy was never allowed. So in reality, this agreement from 2015 that was going to lead to a ceasefire was never really used. In a military standpoint, it was used, but because there were far less fights and far less wars, but it never stopped. So since 2014 up until 2022, up until last week's invasion, that changed pretty much everything, there have been between 14 and 15,000 people who have lost their lives, and 1.5 million of people who are now refugees, not the actual refugees from these days, but the refugees that fled Ukraine since 2014, the majority from 2014 to 2016, and fled to other parts of the country. So we are now to the actual situation today, and this fight clearly has some deep roots in history. Both parts have talked about this fight in two very different ways. Russia always said one thing, the rest of Ukraine and the central government, Kiev, always said a completely different thing. Information, communication and propaganda are very important, and as well as what is being said. Politics and media are saying different things, so the public opinion forms its own opinion. Citizens have their own idea. I remember what some friends told me. I remember one of my interpreters in Ukraine who lived mainly in Kiev, but would also often travel to the southeast, to the area where there were wars. He always told me that anytime I travel, I see some things, certain things, and when I go back home, my family members, my friends, people I know, tell me a completely different thing. So I realize how narration is also important. So, as Sveva was saying at the beginning of this class, as she was saying, there are certain words that are quite strong and quite important. The actors of this crisis, for example, Vladimir Putin, talked about denazification of Ukraine. But why? Throughout history, if we go back to the Second World War, for example, Ukraine was a battleground for many people who lost their lives, many refugees, and Ukraine was partially occupied by Nazi Germany. So the same thing that happened in other countries happened in Ukraine. Some Ukrainians cooperated with Nazi Germany. This, of course, didn't happen only in Ukraine, if you know the history. In the more recent times, as I said, when Ukraine was officially created, authorities tried to create a national identity so that there could be a population with its own culture within a certain area, certain border, that shared the same culture. Of course, this attempt was something that some parts of the population felt more strongly, and others felt more pro-Russia, were much more nationalist. And I say this because when I travel to Ukraine, I often hear certain strong words. For example, Kiev has a Nazi or a fascist government, something that I didn't believe, but I know that there's a part of Ukrainian politics that gives a strong thinks that nationalism is very important. But we can discuss what we mean by nation. We will get to this shortly. Diana Shendrikova will speak more specifically about this. So history, narration, culture, identity are all together. They are interconnected. And I want to show you, before letting Diana speak, a couple more videos. As I said, these are all videos that aired in the past few years in Switzerland, and these videos are by Claudio Maggiolini. So, about language and identity, I want to show you what was going on and what is going on. So this is video number 4 that I'll show you. It was recorded in March of 2014. We are in Kharkov. Depending on how you pronounce it, there's a different way, Russian Ukraine. So in March 2014, there was the referendum, so this was filmed during those days when there was a referendum about Crimea. This is the story of a woman, a young woman, and her decision that came from a few years before, because she had lived outside Ukraine. She decided to go back to Ukraine. So from this story we can see the difference of identities.
Anna, 35 anni, ha 2 figli. Sasha, la più grande, studia pianoforte. Suo fratello, Timur, deve ancora cominciare la scuola. Qualche anno fa, quando le sue amiche partivano per l'Europa, Anna ha deciso di tornare in Ucraina e di fare l'insegnante di inglese. La mia famiglia è in Australia ormai da parecchio tempo. Io a un certo punto ho capito che dovevo tornare indietro. È successo quando sono nati i miei figli. Volevo che crescessero qui, dove ci sono le nostre radici storiche e culturali. Volevo che parlassero la lingua dei loro genitori e dei loro nonni. La lingua che si parla qui è il russo. L'est dell'Ucraina è la zona russofona del paese. Un'identità culturale che la lega molto a Mosca, anche se spesso le aspirazioni politiche non vanno nella stessa direzione. Come ogni madre, per i miei figli vorrei sicurezza, felicità e una buona educazione, ma questo richiederebbe un paese stabile, indipendente, in grado di scegliere da che parte stare. In sostanza vorrei che l'Ucraina dei miei bimbi avesse buone prospettive economiche e una classe politica non così corrotta come quella di oggi. Ma per ora, con il referendum in Crimea, nessuno è in grado di fare previsioni. Io ho molta paura, è qualcosa di irrazionale, non riesco a spiegarlo. Qui a Kharkiv non sta succedendo nulla di grave, ma la paura è nell'aria. Non sappiamo nemmeno chi siano gli amici e i nemici, però credo che lo capiremo molto presto. Anna ci porta in piazza, nel centro di Kharkiv. Queste sono ore di tensione, di attesa. Nell'est dell'Ucraina il passato sovietico è ancora molto vivo, un legame che l'incertezza del futuro potrebbe rendere ancora più forte.
Okay, now it was 2014, and in that year, in that days, I would like to make you hear some voice of young people from that days in Atwood University. Kharkiv is a city where there's war at the moment. We saw that square, and that today is completely destroyed. In that days, these days, we went to the university to understand the point of view during that particular delicate moment, how young people were experiencing that moment, kids your age. It's video number 6, thank you.
L'Università di Kharkiv è sempre stata una delle più importanti dell'est europeo, fin dai tempi dell'Unione Sovietica. Qui ogni anno arrivano migliaia di studenti. Sono le nuove generazioni che segneranno il futuro dell'Ucraina, oggi ancora molto incerto. Mi piacerebbe che la Crimea e l'Ucraina, compreso l'est, fossero un unico paese. Non sono d'accordo. Sono contenta che la Crimea abbia votato per entrare nella Federazione Russa, è giusto così. Non credo che succederà lo stesso con le regioni orientali, ma spero che tra noi e la Russia ci siano sempre ottimi rapporti. La Crimea però è cosa diversa rispetto alle regioni orientali a ridosso del confine russo. Qui, nonostante i profondi legami economici e culturali, l'appoggio a Mosca non è scontato. Mi sento in una situazione scomoda. È come se dovessimo scegliere a tutti i costi da che parte stare, con la Russia o con l'Europa. Ma io vorrei che il mio fosse un paese indipendente, con i suoi valori, senza interferenze. Gli studenti ucraini sono determinati a dare il loro contributo, ma si aspettano una classe dirigente in grado di gestire le tante divisioni all'interno del paese. Vorrei che in futuro venissero garantiti gli stessi diritti a tutti gli studenti, a prescindere dalle loro radici storiche o culturali, e vorrei anche un sistema educativo indipendente dalla politica. Di fianco all'Università di Kharkiv è esposta la videoinstallazione di Mykola Ridny, un giovane artista che ha rappresentato l'Ucraina all'ultima Biennale di Venezia. Con lui cerchiamo di capire se l'arte possa contribuire a tenere insieme un paese con così tante differenze. L'arte ha il pregio di poter comunicare delle cose in modo non violento, per questo credo che possa tenere insieme posizioni opposte. Il mio obiettivo è produrre opere che vengano comprese in tutto il mondo. È il compito dell'arte contemporanea, creare un linguaggio in grado di comunicare ovunque, pur descrivendo realtà locali. Potrebbe essere la chiave per risolvere questa crisi, non cancellare il passato, ma utilizzarlo per costruire un nuovo paese.
Adesso rimaniamo ad Kharkiv, quindi
Now,
rimaniamo a
let's
poche decine di
stay
chilometri dal
around
confine
10
russo,
kilometers far
per
from
vedere
that
l'ultimo
city.
video per
I would
questa
like to show
parte.
you
Questo
another
invece è stato
video
girato,
that
questi video che
was
abbiamo visto adesso erano del 2014. Questo video
the
invece risale
last
a
two were
10
from
giorni fa.
2014,
E
whereas
anche
the one you're
questo ci
about
dà
to
un po' il
see is
senso
from a few days ago,
dell'importanza di
and it talks
questo
about the importance
elemento linguistico
of this
identitario che ci porta
identity
in questo
and
senso
linguistic
poi
element
ad
that
arrivare
would
alla
help
parte
us to
successiva di questa
go to the
lezione.
next
Allora
part
io
of
chiedo
our
appunto scusa
lecture.
a Converso che fa la
I
regia
would
perché
like to
faccio un
ask
salto
Converso,
indietro rispetto alla scaletta che ci siamo dati,
since
dove ho bacchettato,
I'm
e il
about
video
to
numero
show
5,
the fifth video. Okay, thank you.
Una spaccatura che Kiev ancora oggi non riesce a gestire in modo ottimale. Proprio su questa battaglia culturale vediamo il reportage dei nostri collaboratori Emanuele Valenti e Claudio Maggiolini.
Oggi, 15 febbraio, è l'anniversario del ritiro sovietico dall'Afghanistan. Viene ricordato in molte città un tempo sotto l'Unione Sovietica, anche qui ad Kharkiv, in Ucraina. Andrei Jesik è un membro di un partito di opposizione che ha spesso una posizione di apertura nei confronti della Russia. Il suo leader è agli arresti domiciliari. Russi e ucraini sono un unico popolo, difficile dividerli. Qui lo sappiamo bene, ma il governo ha provato a farlo, così come ha provato a dividere la nostra società, per esempio restringendo l'uso della lingua russa nel sistema educativo. La crisi di oggi si può risolvere solo con maggiore autonomia per le regioni russofone, con gli accordi di Minsk. Non c'è alternativa. La legge che ha limitato l'uso della lingua russa nel settore pubblico è del 2019. Andiamo alla facoltà di medicina dell'Università di Kharkiv. Anche qui insegnano in ucraino, una mossa con la quale il governo cerca di allontanare la società dalla Russia. Nikolai Trotsenko, un veterano della guerra sovietica in Afghanistan, insegna medicina militare. Il suo studio è una specie di museo della guerra. La legge dice che l'istruzione superiore vada fatta in lingua ucraina. Noi la rispettiamo. Molti penseranno in russo e poi, almeno nei luoghi pubblici, parleranno in ucraino. Ci adeguiamo. È invece un problema per le persone anziane. Non le puoi forzare a usare una lingua che non conoscono dalla nascita. Andiamo dagli studenti di Nikolai. Sono al primo anno di università. Stanno imparando a lavorare sul campo in caso di conflitto armato. Un'eventualità mai così attuale come in questi anni. In Ucraina c'è una guerra dal 2014. Qui ci sono studenti internazionali e da diverse zone dell'Ucraina. Le lezioni sono in ucraino e in inglese. Certo, quando non capiamo qualcosa ci spiegano in russo, utile soprattutto in queste regioni di cultura russa. Finora la diplomazia ha bloccato un eventuale nuovo conflitto armato, ma in Ucraina si combatte da tempo una guerra culturale.
Ecco, questo fino a pochi giorni fa, pochi giorni prima dell'inizio di questa guerra, torneremo
Before
poi
the start of the
a
war,
quello che sta succedendo oggi. Adesso do la parola
what was going on. Now I would like to give the floor to Diana Shendrikova, who has joined us a while ago, so I know that she has been listening. She is a lecturer at Civica Scuola, and she will be talking about the importance of the linguistic and identitary
Grazie mille Emanuele, grazie mille a
thank you everyone
per
for
essere
being
oggi
here,
qui e grazie anche alla
and
scuola
also thank
per,
you to the school
per organizzare
for having
l'evento. Si vede che
organized
hanno come obiettivo
an initiative
unire
that
le
wants
persone
to bring people together
e dare delle domande,
and
cioè, farsi delle domande,
and make people ask
dare delle
themselves
risposte che non
questions
sono facili,
and
che non
give
possono
answers
essere
that are not easy,
delle risposte facili
because they cannot be easy
ai problemi così
to
complessi e
there
difficili
cannot be easy
che stiamo vivendo. Le
answers to
risposte
such
facili è la
problems.
propaganda, ma noi non
Just the
vogliamo la
propaganda
propaganda,
can
no?
give
E per
easy
questo,
answers, and
esatto, per questo
that is why
bisognerà pensare
we will
tanto,
have to
avere
think a lot,
tanto pensiero critico
have a
tutti i
critical
giorni, e
thought,
queste iniziative come oggi
and
e
such initiatives
diciamo, questa è la presentazione che ho
such
sentito
as
non
today's
tutti, però
lesson that I have heard,
gran parte di Emanuele
I heard the majority of it,
ci dà delle chiavi
gives us
per,
keys,
ci dà degli strumenti
gives us
per
tools
fare dei nostri ragionamenti
to
e questo è molto
create, to build
quello che
a
volevo
thought. And what I wanted
raccontarvi oggi
to tell you
nonostante sia un
today,
momento molto
even though
difficile
it's a very confusing
per
moment
noi,
for
per me
all of us
che
and for me as well,
sono russa,
I'm Russian.
di nascita, di nazionalità, di cultura,
I'm
lingua,
Russian from nationality, language,
quindi
culture, everything.
è un momento molto doloroso,
And
però
this is a very painful moment, but it is important to try to understand
in questo momento
uh,
delle informazioni
right
vorrei
what the right
innanzitutto,
information is.
come avete capito già, il legame
The
tra Russia e
link
Ucraina
between Russia and Ukraine is
molto tormentato,
is
sarà sempre
very
così,
complex. It has
sempre
always been like this,
però
let alone now.
si parla tanto,
Today,
tanti
people have
studi
been
oggi hanno
talking
approfondito di questa comunanza,
about this
questi popoli fratelli della
this
comunanza,
this
della cultura,
brotherhood
della
between
lingua
populations
tra Russia e
between
Ucraina.
Russia and Ukraine. Where does it come from?
Perché
Why
possiamo parlare di
can we talk about brotherhood?
vorrei,
I would
se
like
potete far vedere la mappa
I would like to show
la prima mappa
the map.
Della di Kiev.
This is
Sì, esatto, perfetto.
okay, perfect.
Allora, questa è la mappa della Russia di Kiev.
This is the map of Kiev's
Diciamo la prima
Russia.
forma statale per tutti
Uh,
i popoli
and this was the first one, the first map established,
essenzialmente vediamo che
and we can see that
occupa il territorio di
it concerns the area
territorio della un po' di Ucraina, diciamo, territorio di adesso di Bielorussia, di Ucraina.
today's Russian and Ukrainian territory.
E qua già nel nome noi sentiamo quella comunanza.
And we can feel that brotherhood, that to understand who's this Russia.
Quindi adesso tutti e tre i popoli tra Ucraina, Bielorussia e
Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia now
a chi appartiene
want to decide to whom this first definition belongs from the 9th century to the 13th century.
And then it was occupied. You can see these green lines. They mean the invasion by different peoples coming from the eastern part of the world. This formation, this portion of the territory was quite developed for the time, and from there our common history starts, our common history between the Ukraine and Russia. And today we still cannot understand and make peace with this history, with this common history. Who is the master of this common history? Who does it belong to? It belongs to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, because it's a common history and a common territory. It has always been difficult. Emanuele has already told you in very great detail about this, but I want to concentrate, I want to focus on the linguistic aspect of this relation. When Ukraine was part of the Tsar Empire, from 1901, excuse me, till 1917, when the Russian-Soviet Revolution at the end of the First World War began, and Russia lost the war, the First World War. The empire tried to make the Ukrainian peoples more Russian, especially those that were living in the empire's territory, the territory around the Volga river, where a lot of Ukrainians moved. The Russification, if we can call it like that, began. The names of schools and villages became more Russian. So this was a period of time where Russians really tried to make other peoples more Russian, coming from the Ukraine, of course. The Soviets then tried to do something different because they wanted to make people see that they were different compared to the Tsars, that they were more understanding, maybe. In 1917, 1918 till the 70s, there was a strong line of thought towards the new Soviet republics, where the Soviets wanted to give more freedom, more independence to these republics. Lenin, during his first years of government, had more European ideas, if we can call them that, where all the Soviet republics could speak their own language. They were part of the Soviet Union, but they could speak whatever language they wanted. This was a very forward-seeing idea, but it was abandoned because it was not feasible at the time. But this nationalist feeling in the republics that made up the Soviet Union was already there. In 1932, under the Stalin government, Stalin understood the danger of this line of thought for his way of thinking, for his ideas for the Soviet Union, because according to Stalin it was a situation that was too dangerous, because there was too much freedom, too much independence, excuse me, and especially Ukraine, in Stalin's mind, was too independent and too free. So he wanted all the republics that made up the Soviet Union to be Soviet, not different republics, Ukrainian, Belarus. He just wanted a union, everybody to be the same. He wanted to create a new nationality that would have a common history and a common identity. This new entity, the Soviet Union, would cancel the traditional characteristic, the traditional traits of the different republics and create a new identity. So this brought to the unification of the Soviet Union from a linguistic point of view as well. So all the individualities got cancelled under Stalin's government. Not entirely, but most of them. And then we get to the fall of the Soviet Union, which Emanuele illustrated very well a few moments ago. I just want to focus on some other things. And I want to talk about the Donbass. We are talking about the Donbass a lot lately. Why has it been such a heated zone during these years? So, in this map, Russian-speaking people in the Ukraine are living almost everywhere, in every part of Ukraine. As a result of the policy of the Ukrainian government, they are less, but not just in the Ukraine. We have this policy of nationalization and unification of the country, but the Baltic Republic are seeing this movement as well, a unification of their territory through the language as well. So in order to be a country, there should be a common language. There are different countries that have a different line of thought in this regard, but that's what's happening in most of the countries in the world. So the red on the map is the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. Being a Russian-speaking person doesn't really mean that you have links with Russia or that you are a supporter of the Russian government automatically. So we saw that in the videos that Emanuele showed. I just wanted to underline this, but the Russian government is trying to pass this message to the Russian population.
Donbass is extremely important, and it was really important even during the Soviet Union period, because as we can see on the next map, in Donbass there were coal reserves that were key for the Soviet Union industry and even for Ukrainian industry. And during the Soviet Union, Ukrainian miners were privileged. Donbas was a very rich region, but miners in Donbas were one of the first categories that started in 1989 to protest, and lots of people say that thanks to their protests that were huge, this was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union fell, and the same happened for the Afghanistan war. But why did they protest? Because Donbas was a really rich region, and you could find everything in Donbas, every resource that you wanted. You could find clothes, food. So the Soviet Union was divided into first category parts, second category, third category parts, and Donbas was one of the first category parts. And that's why the industrial industry was really developed here. And after 1989, everything started to disappear. There weren't jobs anymore, and they started to protest. So this region is really important, historically speaking. It's really important, even economically speaking, actually. It's important for the development of the future of the fall of the Soviet Union. And actually, in some way, maybe, and this is actually my opinion, what I think. So a lot of people can't really forgive this region for what I explained. So we're not talking about a region that's in the suburbs, or it's really important. It's really strategically important, both for Russia and for Ukraine. And now, just as my talk is coming to an end, and as I see that there are a lot of questions, which makes me very happy, I would like to say, I would like to explain to you the reason why we can't really understand each other anymore. What did we do wrong in the last 20, 30 years? Since the moment in which Russia and Ukraine are two separate states, two separate countries. Maybe you could think that this is a rhetoric question, but what I mean is, and I'm sure that this was a mistake made by the Russian government, they started to create a link at a high level, at a state level. So let's talk about gas agreements in between oligarchs among us. Our people will thrive, thankfully and finally. So they started talking at a high level, at a high political level. So during this power play, with the willingness to impose their power, to others. We forgot to develop cultural relations between people, scientific diplomacy, cultural diplomacy in between countries. We forgot to explore what's happening inside Ukrainian society. The Ukrainian society was forged as a political identity, and I think this was something that surprised Ukrainian people and surprised all of us, because Ukrainian society started as an independent society, and this process has been completed. And now, in Russia, we can't really understand what Ukraine is, even though we learned about that in our history books. We don't understand the social processes that are happening in Ukraine. We never actually wondered, we never asked ourselves what's happening, especially in the highest levels of politics in Ukraine. And this is a tragedy, and I think it's one of the reasons, emotional reasons, why we are living this tragedy. Thank you. Thank you, Diana. And I'll go back to you in a moment. I would like to add a couple of things before answering the questions. First of all, I would like to say that a lot of people asked if you can rewatch this lecture. Yes, you can, at the same link that you received to watch in streaming this, to stream this lecture. You can see it again and see the recording of this lecture. And of course, on the website of the Scuola Civica, you'll have the link to go back and rewatch this lecture on the same link that you used today, or in a couple of days on the website of the school. You will be able to rewatch this lecture. I'll try to make things even easier for you. I don't have I'm not directly into this as Diana is, and I don't have an emotional link to this topic. So I would like to speak about all the levels that I mentioned before after listening to the digression of Diana and answering to some of the questions that have arrived. Of course, there is a complexity, there is an identity, a culture, and a language problem throughout history. There is a political side of it, of course, especially when we talk about Vladimir Putin, Russian-speaking people, denazification of Ukraine, and of course, the main concern of the political power in Russia is their national safety, and of course, the expansion of NATO eastward concerned Russia very much, and Russia has been saying this for years now. At the moment, to justify such a military action that we saw in these days, they used some elements. Ukraine, that is trying to join NATO and is threatening our safety, but we want to protect Donbas because it's a pro-Russian region, because that is a region that Russia, or parts of Russia, and today we can say that most people that have the power in Russia feel like Donbas is part of their nation, not state, be careful, but nation. And of course, Diana can correct me if I was wrong, but I wanted to make things easy for you. Some people ask me, why is everything's happening now, all at once? Well, maybe because of Putin, but there are some elements, global elements, that we can understand why Russia wanted to do this today, now, because they considered that this could be a response. And of course they're afraid of all the sanctions, but they think that sanctions will not go further. At the moment, the United States are retiring from Afghanistan. Why now? Because the relation with China are even more strict. And talking about China, we can speak about an element that of course, you'll know, the element of gas and energy. Diana started talking about the relationship between Europe and Russia from an energy point of view. Of course, we import 40% of our gas from Russia, but at the same time, the majority of the gas we import goes to China. So at the moment, we are in a situation in which Russia can be supported by China for this kind of import. So they can afford these sanctions that Europe is imposing on them. So, but I remind you that Europe is still importing gas and oil.
I want to ask you one of the questions that came in. So, the importance of Putin's leadership. What was the USSR in the past? One of the questions is one of Putin's goals to bring back together the Soviet Union or a similar union? Recently, Putin stated that the dissolution of the USSR was one of the worst mistakes in history. What do you think about this? Yes, the thing that you said is often mentioned, and I think that Putin really believes this. For him, the fall of the USSR is the worst tragedy, the worst geopolitical tragedy that has ever happened in human history. But we have to make some distinctions. Rebuilding the USSR, just like it was in the past, is very difficult to do, and I think that is something that the Russian leadership also understands this. Their way of governing show this. In the Baltic states, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they were part of the USSR, but they were also considered European countries in the USSR, a little bit different. They speak different languages, so it's not a Slavic language. And if we watch the TV and Putin's speeches, this is not his aim. He believes that he will not get those countries back, but obviously I can't predict what will happen in the future, but I'm trying to explain what I saw in the last few years. But that area isn't very interesting from a Russian point of view. In countries such as Central Asia, there is also a very peculiar situation. It's important to have good relations with them, to have exports for uranium from Kazakhstan. And it's very important for nuclear energy in Russia. It's a sort of buffer zone, but that area is not considered a Slav historic region. What Putin might think and what he may do to influence people is to rebuild this union of Slav people under Russia's leadership. This is more, this is easier for Putin, and he managed to control Lukashenko before the repressions. Lukashenko is considered a dictator from his population, and Belarus right now is not completely independent because it depends on Russia. And Putin so managed to control Belarus completely, and he did it. Belarus did it by itself, and so this country became part of Moscow's sphere of influence. And that's the same thing that Putin wants to do with Ukraine, with the annexation of Crimea in the past and the unification of Slavic people. That's surely one of his goals. He doesn't want a strong Ukraine, a pro-European Ukraine, and that can develop in a completely different way from the Russian one. Thank you, Diana. I shared my map again in order to help with your explanation and the importance of the various geographic areas. Russia is more interested in the European part, so Belarus and Ukraine, and they're not very interested in the Baltic area, as well as Asia. So all the countries that are located over Afghanistan. So this is particularly for young people. The main goals for the possible reunification of the USSR, so Putin's goal goes in this direction, and therefore it's coming towards Europe. And this is where Russia feels threatened. Many of you asked what might happen now. What are the possible developments in the following days, weeks, or months? As Diana said, it's impossible to interpret Russia's way of thinking, or at least that's what concerns me. So it's difficult to find some news and anticipate pieces of news. I talked with many people that work with the Russian leadership in Moscow, and they never actually answered to my question, because it's impossible to really understand and predict what might happen. In the many elements of this crisis, there is a particular dimension that concerns the psychology of Putin. And his choice last week has brought this crisis on a completely different level. So where are they mostly acting, Russia? Well, from a military point of view, we know that the main attacks are mainly in the north, so on the border with Belarus and Russia. Diana talked about the important alliance between Moscow and Belarus, and she talked about Lukashenko, the Belarus president, and he is not appreciated by Putin, but is useful to him, because Belarus is part of this geographical area. So let's go back to the military action in the north of Kiev, in the northeast of the country, up until the southeast of Ukraine, in Donbass, where part of this area is already under Russian control. And then we have the southern region. During these last few hours, they are trying to take control of Mariupol, and Russian troops also took control in Kherson, in the south, on the Black Sea. I hope that I am pronouncing everything correctly. And they are trying to reach Odessa, a very crucial city with a long history. But they are mainly located in the border areas, so the Baltic Sea, and then in the east. Although they are moving towards the center. They fear the arrival of Russian troops in Dnipropetrovsk, and what I was talking about before is something very recent, because Russians have taken control of the nuclear plant in Zaporizhzhia, where a fire broke out in another building near the nuclear plant. So a very eastern area.
Right now, this seems to be the strategy, and as you can see, the military strategy follows the history. But the way I see this is that in any case, the main objective is either take control and take power, or have a government in Kiev that accepts Russia. And if this doesn't happen, it is possible that this Russian operation will spread to the entire country. This seems unlikely. Some people have asked this, but I don't think this will lead to fights to other countries. So this means NATO countries. Even yesterday, both Russia and some Western countries have mentioned a nuclear war. I think that this is a level where we are not there yet, but we will never get there. It is, again, impossible to make a prediction. I would like to ask a question to Diana. It has something to do with politics and what you said at the end of your part. We can't understand each other. And from what I gathered in the last few years, there is a difficulty to understand each other among the Western diplomacy and Russian diplomacy. It seems as if there is an impossibility to understand some aspects or even understand certain messages. So it is also a problem in communication among the various parts. So I want to ask you what you think about this. Thank you for this question, because I think that this is a fundamental part. And here we will talk about the importance of communication and diplomacy. I would like to go back to the end of the USSR and the beginning of the new reality, so with new countries that were formed after 1991, so former USSR countries that are now independent countries. So that was the moment where everyone was really enthusiastic, really happy. Especially there was a great enthusiasm towards the West. We were really close. We were part of the West. We really depended on the West, and we felt really close. There was a lot of hope in a future, in a friendly future, especially because the wall had fallen, so everyone was close once again. So this was the general feeling. Now we don't really talk about it, but even Putin mentioned it in his speech. This was a historic speech where he tried to justify or even give a reason to the Russian people. This was his longest speech to try to explain why this is happening. And here he mentioned that Russia asked at some point to join NATO. And this, of course, was rejected. But at the time when we were so close, we had so much hope to unify once again with the West, have new friendships. At that time, the West was a bit cold towards Russia. Russia was treated like the poor relative that lost the war, and so they are desperate, and they kind of brush it off and forget about it. So this was something that they didn't deal with. We were waiting that Europe would meet us and welcome us with open arms, but this didn't happen. We were never treated as equal. I'm trying to exaggerate right now, but this is how this feeling of resentment started. So this love, that unrequited love. And from that moment, little by little, Russia slowly became much more closed off. We know, if we look at history, if we look at even Italy's history or Germany's history, those countries that have those feelings that they aren't being treated equally, in those countries there are particular political regimes that are hostile towards the West. So there was also this idea of the country, an idea that came from the elite, that the country was isolated and surrounded by all its enemies. And all around Russia there are enemies that want to attack it. So this is something that people have been told since around 2007. And this is what this was a game changer. So from this moment on, the feeling grew stronger. We now think that this has always been the situation. You are very young and you think that this was always this feeling with Russia. But even Putin, throughout his 20 years in power, was quite different. He was quite different in the beginning. So in the past 20 years that have been different types of Russia, and Putin was different. And the relations with the West were always tense. There were moments from both parts weren't really taken advantage of, and they didn't pay particular attention to certain occasions before they became the sentiment. Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much. I would like to end by talking briefly again about emotions and the emotions that we mentioned earlier. And so we have to consider Vladimir Putin, but also we have to consider Ukraine's feelings. Regardless of the outcome of this war, I feel that, because I have visited the country a few times, this is something that will last for long, regardless of the political and military outcome. So even without a Russian presence in Ukraine, a large part of the country will still be opposed to Russia for generations, even because of their personal experiences, because of course the war has its effects on people. I know that I have friends who have decided to go and fight in the last few days. This is a feeling that will still appear in that area, still exists in that area of Ukraine that is historically much closer to Russia. So there won't be anything to fix for a few generations, for several generations. And the second thing I want to say regarding perception and participation, and even emotional participation, we have seen how important it is how people react. Everything can change. And I have noticed that even here in Europe, here in Italy, there are call to actions to help Ukraine. And even in my home, they asked me, what is something that you don't wear?
We should send them for Ukrainian people fleeing from war. And I realized how this confirms how this conflict is universal. And in the last years, and still today, there are wars, conflicts in the world that are making a lot of victims, refugees, situations of poverty, even before these wars. and we don't even know it. This is a different situation. As I was saying, there is also this global situation in our own dimension. We can feel it, and this is important to understand the situations of crisis. I know that we now the time is over. Those who have followed the lesson should know that they can re-watch the lesson that has been recorded. So I would like to thank you all. Thank you to the classroom, the students. Thank you, Diana Shendrikova. Thank you, Converso, for the technical help. Fabrizia Parini, president of the Altiero Spinelli School. Have a good day, everybody. Let's see you on Friday, not with everyone. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you. There were a lot of people listening, and I thank you all for this. I hope that we have understood something, and let's hope this conflict to end with peace. Thank you.